August 1944. Caen Sector, Normandy. The smell of death hung over the French countryside like a blanket. 62 days had passed since Allied soldiers stormed the beaches on D-Day. Everyone thought the war would be over by now. Everyone was wrong. Instead, thousands of young men were dying every single day in the maze of hedgerows that covered the Norman farmland. The Germans called this country bocage. The Allied soldiers had another name for it. They called it hell. General Dwight Eisenhower stood in his headquarters and stared at maps that showed almost no movement. His staff officers moved pins on the board, but the pins barely budged from week to week. The numbers told a terrible story. 5,000 casualties every day. That meant 5,000 fathers, brothers, and sons killed or wounded before the sun went down. The British Second Army had lost so many officers that some companies were led by sergeants. The casualty rate among officers had reached 300% in some units. That meant every officer position had been filled 3 different times because men kept dying. Eisenhower had promised the politicians back home that Allied forces would break out of Normandy by the end of July. July had come and gone. Now it was August, and his armies were still stuck in the same muddy fields. The Supreme Commander could feel the pressure building like steam in a kettle. Winston Churchill was asking hard questions. President Roosevelt was getting nervous. Newspapers were starting to wonder if the invasion had failed. The German defenses were not getting weaker. They were getting stronger. Every attack followed the same pattern. Artillery would pound German positions for hours. Thousands of shells would scream through the air and explode in deafening blasts. Then infantry would move forward across open fields. German machine guns would open fire. Men would fall like wheat cut by a scythe. The survivors would dig holes in the ground and wait. Officers would call for another artillery barrage. The whole bloody process would start again. A good day meant moving forward 300 yards. A bad day meant moving backward. The British had just tried their biggest attack yet. Operation Goodwood had thrown 3 entire armored divisions at the German lines near Caen. The planners had been confident. They had dropped more than 7,000 tons of bombs on the Germans before the tanks rolled forward. Surely, nothing could survive that kind of punishment. But when the smoke cleared, German anti-tank guns were still working. They destroyed over 400 British tanks in 3 days. The advance gained exactly 3 miles. Eisenhower had run out of time, and he was running out of ideas. The veteran generals who surrounded Eisenhower saw the problem as simple mathematics. Breaking through strong defenses required accepting heavy losses. That was just how war worked. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery spoke about attrition as if it were weather, something you could not change, only endure. American generals nodded in agreement. They had studied the same battles at West Point and Sandhurst. They knew that frontal assaults were costly. But what else could be done? The enemy had to be hit hard and hit repeatedly until they broke. This was the conventional wisdom. This was how wars had always been won. Into this crisis walked a man who had no business commanding armies. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds was only 41 years old. That made him the youngest corps commander in any Allied army. Simonds had risen through the ranks of the tiny Canadian Army, a military force so small that most British and American officers had never heard of it. He had graduated from Royal Military College of Canada, not West Point or Sandhurst. He had never commanded troops in the First World War because he was too young. The professional soldiers who staffed Eisenhower's headquarters looked at Simonds and saw an amateur playing in a game for professionals. But Eisenhower saw something different. Simonds had a reputation for studying problems until he understood them completely. He asked questions that made senior officers uncomfortable. He challenged assumptions that everyone else accepted without thinking. Most importantly, he won battles. His Canadian Corps had captured more ground with fewer casualties than any comparable force. Eisenhower started calling Simonds into planning meetings. The British generals did not like this. The American generals raised their eyebrows, but Eisenhower kept asking for the quiet Canadian from the unknown army. Simonds spent days reviewing the reports from Operation Goodwood. He walked the battlefield and talked to tank commanders who had survived the assault. He studied the timing of every attack the Allies had launched since D-Day. A pattern became clear to him. Every assault happened the same way. Artillery fired in the morning. Bombers arrived in the afternoon. Tanks attacked in daylight. The Germans always knew when an attack was coming and exactly where it would hit. They had plenty of time to move their anti-tank guns into position. They could call for reinforcements and prepare their defenses. The Allies were trying to win a chess game while showing their opponent every move before making it. Simonds sat in his command tent as the sun set over Normandy. The sound of distant artillery rumbled like summer thunder. Young soldiers walked past his tent, their faces already looking old. Tomorrow they would attack again. Tomorrow more of them would die. Simonds lit a cigarette and stared at his maps. The truth was simple but radical. He turned to his staff officers and spoke quietly. We are attacking exactly when and how they expect us to. That has to change. Simonds gathered his staff officers around a large table, covered with maps and photographs. His plan was unlike anything the Allied armies had ever attempted. Operation Totalize would attack at night, not at dawn, not in the afternoon after bombing runs. At night, in total darkness when German defenders could not see what was coming. The plan called for 720 armored vehicles to advance in 4 parallel columns straight down the roads toward Falaise. Tank commanders would navigate using radio beacons and compasses. Infantry would ride inside the tanks instead of walking behind them. The attack would begin at 11:30 at night, exactly when German soldiers were settling into their bunkers, and command posts were filing evening reports. The idea was radical because night attacks with tanks had never worked before. Tanks could not see in the dark. They got lost, crashed into each other, and wandered into minefields. Every military manual said that armored formations needed daylight to operate effectively. Simonds knew this. He had read the same manuals. But he also knew that German anti-tank guns needed daylight too. They needed to see their targets to kill them. Darkness was the enemy of both sides. The question was, which side could adapt faster? The biggest challenge was protecting the infantry. Soldiers could not keep up with tanks on foot. They moved too slowly and made easy targets for machine guns. Simonds needed a way to carry infantry inside armored vehicles so they could advance at the same speed as the tanks. But the Allied armies did not have armored personnel carriers. They had not been invented yet. Soldiers rode in soft-skinned trucks that offered no protection from bullets or shell fragments. Simonds found his solution in a weapon that was being replaced. The M7 Priest was a self-propelled gun built on a tank chassis. It carried a big artillery piece and had thick armor plating, but newer guns were arriving from America, and the old Priests were being pushed aside. Simonds looked at them and saw something different. He saw armored boxes on tracks. His engineers could remove the artillery gun and create space for soldiers inside. Each converted vehicle could carry 10 infantrymen protected by the same armor that stopped machine gun bullets. The conversion work began immediately. Canadian mechanics worked around the clock in repair yards behind the front lines. They cut away gun mounts with torches that threw sparks into the night air. They welded metal plates over holes. They installed benches for soldiers to sit on. The smell of hot metal and welding gas filled the workshops. In just 48 hours, 75 M7 Priests became the world's first armored personnel carriers. Simonds called them kangaroos because they carried soldiers like a mother kangaroo carries her baby. The second part of the plan was even more daring. Simonds wanted heavy bombers to strike German positions at 11:30 at night, right before his tanks attacked. Night bombing was something new and frightening. The Royal Air Force had been bombing German cities at night for years, but those raids dropped explosives over wide areas. Simonds wanted precision strikes on specific targets in complete darkness. He needed Pathfinder aircraft to mark the targets with colored flares, then waves of heavy bombers to hit those exact spots without striking his own troops just a few hundred yards away. When Simonds presented his plan to British Bomber Command, the response was immediate and harsh. Air marshals said night precision bombing was impossible. Their pilots could barely find entire cities in the dark. Finding specific German strongpoints in Norman farmland would be suicide. They would hit Allied positions by mistake and kill thousands of their own men. One air marshal called the idea reckless and irresponsible. Another said Simonds was asking for a disaster that would cost hundreds of aircrew lives. The plan seemed dead. Without air support, the night attack would face German bunkers at full strength. But Simonds had one powerful ally who believed in taking risks. Eisenhower had watched his conventional attacks fail for 2 months. He was ready to try something unconventional. The Supreme Commander overruled the objections from Bomber Command. He gave Simonds direct access to bombing assets and told the air marshals to make it work. If a Canadian general from a tiny army thought night bombing could succeed, Eisenhower was willing to bet lives on it. The preparation became frantic. Engineers set up radio beacons along the roads that tanks would follow. These beacons sent out electronic signals that tank navigators could track even in pitch darkness. Other teams mounted searchlights on vehicles and pointed them straight up at the clouds. When turned on, these lights would create artificial moonlight by bouncing their beams off the cloud cover. The effect was called Monty's moonlight, and it would give tank crews just enough light to see the vehicles ahead of them. August 7th arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures. As the sun set, soldiers climbed into their vehicles and checked their equipment one last time. Infantry settled into the Kangaroos, feeling strange to be riding inside armored boxes instead of walking. Tank commanders studied their maps under red-filtered flashlights that would not ruin their night vision. Radio operators tested their sets and confirmed they could hear the navigation beacons. Officers synchronized their watches. Everyone knew the exact time. At 11:30 p.m., 1,000 Royal Air Force bombers would arrive overhead. The night came down like a curtain. Stars appeared in the sky above Normandy. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, German soldiers stood guard and wondered when the next attack would come. They expected it to arrive tomorrow morning. They expected artillery at dawn and tanks at noon. They did not expect what was about to happen. At exactly 11:30, the first Pathfinder aircraft appeared overhead. Soldiers heard the distant drone of engines growing louder. Colored flares began falling from the sky, marking German strongpoints with eerie green and red light. Then came the heavy bombers. The sound was like standing beside a waterfall, a constant roaring thunder that shook the ground and rattled teeth. Bombs began falling on German positions 9 miles away. The earth jumped and heaved as explosions turned night into day. Simonds gave the order to advance. 720 vehicles lurched forward in 4 columns. The first nighttime armored attack in history had begun. In 12 hours, they would penetrate 9 miles into German territory. Operation Goodwood had taken 3 days to advance 3 miles. Simonds had just changed warfare forever. The columns of tanks and kangaroos rolled forward through the darkness like iron rivers. Canadian infantrymen sat inside their armored carriers and felt the whole vehicle shake and bounce over the rough ground. The roar of engines was so loud that men had to shout directly into each other's ears to be heard. Above them, the sky was filled with the thunder of 1,000 bombers dropping their deadly cargo on German positions ahead. Tracer fire from anti-aircraft guns streaked upward, creating ribbons of light that looked like meteors flying backward into the heavens. The searchlights bouncing off the clouds gave everything an unnatural glow, as if the moon had grown 10 times brighter. German soldiers in their bunkers and fighting positions could not believe what they were seeing. Attacks did not happen at night. Attacks happened after breakfast, when artillery observers could see where shells landed and tank commanders could spot enemy positions. But here came hundreds of vehicles charging straight down the roads in the middle of the night. The rumble of tracks and engines sounded like an approaching earthquake. German officers grabbed field telephones and tried to call for support, but many of their communication lines had been cut by the bombing. Anti-tank gun crews scrambled to their weapons, but they could barely see the targets rushing toward them in the darkness. By dawn, the results were clear and shocking. Simonds' forces had punched 9 miles into German territory in just 12 hours. To understand how extraordinary this was, the numbers told the story. Before Operation Totalize, Allied forces in Normandy had been averaging 0.3 of a mile per day. That meant it took more than 3 days to advance a single mile. After Totalize, the breakthrough rate jumped to 5.2 miles per day. The attack had moved 17 times faster than normal operations. The cost in casualties was also dramatically different. Previous attacks had lost hundreds of men for every mile gained. Totalize captured 9 miles while suffering fewer casualties than a single day of normal fighting. The German 12th SS Panzer Division had been holding the Caen sector since D-Day. They were elite troops, many of them fanatics who believed they could never be defeated. They had stopped every Allied attack for 2 months. British and American forces had thrown everything at them and gained almost nothing. But on the morning of August 8th, the 12th, SS Panzer began withdrawing for the first time. Their commander sent urgent messages to headquarters explaining that his positions had been overrun in the night. He needed permission to pull back or his entire division would be destroyed. The prisoner count told another dramatic story. In a typical major operation, Allied forces might capture 50 to 100 German soldiers in the first day of fighting. Most Germans preferred to fight to the death or escape rather than surrender. But in the first 24 hours of Operation Totalize, more than 1,000 German prisoners came stumbling out of bombed positions with their hands raised. They looked dazed and exhausted. Many said they had never experienced anything like the night attack. One German officer, when questioned by intelligence staff, kept repeating the same words. We could not see them coming. We could not stop what we could not see. News of the breakthrough spread quickly through Allied headquarters. American generals in Brittany began asking questions about how Simonds had achieved such results. Within a week, American forces were quietly testing their own night attack methods based on the Canadian model. They discovered what Simonds had proven. Darkness was a weapon that could be used by the attacker just as effectively as the defender. The old assumption that tanks needed daylight was wrong. Tanks needed better navigation tools and better tactics. Once those were provided, night became an advantage instead of an obstacle. The German High Command reacted with panic. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge had been planning a major counteroffensive near Mortain to cut off American forces that had broken through in the west. But Simonds' breach in the east changed everything. Von Kluge now faced a disaster. If Canadian forces kept pushing south toward Falaise while Americans pushed east, the entire German army in Normandy would be trapped in a pocket with no escape route. Von Kluge cancelled his planned offensive and began desperately trying to contain Simonds' advance. The German counterattack at Mortain, when it finally happened, was weaker and smaller than originally planned. It failed within 3 days. Historians would later argue that Simonds' breakthrough had saved thousands of American lives by forcing the Germans to divide their strength. The Kangaroo armored personnel carriers proved to be an unexpected revolution. Other Allied commanders had watched infantry get slaughtered while walking behind tanks for 2 months. They had accepted this as the natural cost of combined arms warfare. But when they saw Canadian infantry riding inside armored protection, arriving at objectives fresh and ready to fight instead of exhausted and depleted, they immediately wanted their own kangaroos. Within 3 weeks, Eisenhower personally ordered the construction of 300 additional armored personnel carriers based on Simonds' design. British engineers started converting their own obsolete self-propelled guns. American factories began designing purpose-built infantry carriers that would arrive too late for this war but would become standard equipment for the next one. Some British generals tried to downplay Simonds' achievement. They argued that Operation Totalize had succeeded mainly because of the heavy bombing, not because of night tactics. They pointed out that the advance had slowed after the first 12 hours when German reinforcements arrived. Montgomery's staff suggested that any competent commander could have achieved similar results with that much air support, but these criticisms ignored the evidence. Other operations had used even heavier bombing and achieved far less. Goodwood had dropped 7,000 tons of bombs and gained 3 miles. Totalize used similar bombing tonnage and gained 9 miles because the attack came when Germans were not ready for it. The comparison with alternative methods was stark and undeniable. Frontal daylight attacks in Normandy had been producing casualty rates that would have broken the Allied armies if continued for another month. Divisions were losing men faster than replacements could arrive. Some British regiments had been reduced to half strength. The traditional approach of artillery, bombing, and daylight assault was mathematically unsustainable. Simonds had proven that unconventional tactics could achieve better results with fewer losses. The evidence was written in blood and ground gained. One Canadian sergeant who rode in a kangaroo during the attack later wrote a letter home that captured the experience. "We went into battle like men in a steel box with wheels. The noise was so loud I thought my head would split open. But when we got to the German lines, we were still alive and ready to fight. The old way, half of us would have been dead before we got there. This new way, we all made it." His letter was typical of dozens that soldiers sent to families. The men who had survived the attack knew they had witnessed something important. They had seen the future of warfare, and it looked nothing like the past. The full scale of what Simonds had achieved became clear in the weeks that followed. Night armored operations were no longer experimental. They were standard procedure. The kangaroo concept was no longer a desperate improvisation. It was the foundation for every mechanized infantry vehicle that would follow. And the idea that young, unconventional commanders could solve problems that veteran generals could not was no longer radical. It was proven fact. The success of Operation Totalize changed Guy Simonds' role in the Allied command structure almost overnight. Eisenhower had found his troubleshooter, the commander he could send to solve impossible problems. When other operations stalled or faced unexpected resistance, the Supreme Commander increasingly turned to the quiet Canadian with the unconventional ideas. In September, when Allied forces struggled to clear the Scheldt estuary and open the vital port of Antwerp, Eisenhower asked for Simonds. The fighting in the flooded lowlands of Holland was brutal and slow. Every field was a potential death trap, every dike a fortress. Simonds applied the same principle he had used at Totalize. He studied how the enemy expected to be attacked, then did something different. His forces used amphibious vehicles at night to outflank German positions that seemed unassailable. The Scheldt was cleared in weeks instead of months. When Allied armies reached the Rhine River in early 1945, they faced another crisis. The Germans had destroyed every bridge and fortified the eastern bank with overlapping fields of fire. Crossing a major river against determined opposition was one of the hardest operations in warfare. Eisenhower wanted Simonds to help plan the assault. The Canadian general proposed using smokescreens to blind German observers, crossing at multiple points simultaneously to divide enemy forces, and landing paratroopers behind the river defenses to create chaos. The Rhine crossing succeeded with fewer casualties than predicted. Simonds had proven again that careful planning and unconventional tactics could save lives while achieving victory. But even as Simonds continued to win battles, something strange was happening to his reputation. The victories were real, the innovations were documented, but the recognition went elsewhere. Field Marshal Montgomery took credit for operations that Simonds had planned and executed. British newspapers wrote glowing stories about Montgomery's brilliance while barely mentioning the Canadian general who had done the actual work. American reporters focused on their own generals and rarely crossed into Canadian sectors. Simonds did not help his own cause by being quiet and modest. He gave short interviews and avoided the spotlight. He seemed uncomfortable with praise and preferred to let his results speak for themselves. The British official history of the war, written by professional historians after 1945, gave Simonds proper credit for his innovations. The authors recognized that Operation Totalize had introduced tactics that transformed modern warfare. They documented how the kangaroo concept had led directly to the development of armored personnel carriers in every major army. They noted that night operations with armor had become standard procedure because Simonds proved it could work. But official histories sit on library shelves. They are read by scholars and military professionals, not by the general public. Montgomery wrote his own memoirs and became a household name. Simonds quietly retired and faded from public memory. The Canadian general's contributions lived on in ways he never sought to publicize. By the 1950s, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was establishing standard procedures for its member armies. Night armored operations appeared in training manuals as basic doctrine. Every NATO tank commander learned to navigate using radio beacons and artificial lighting. Infantry soldiers expected to ride into battle inside armored vehicles instead of walking behind tanks. These methods seemed obvious and natural to the new generation of military officers. They had no idea that 20 years earlier, these same tactics had been considered impossible and reckless. Simonds had changed warfare so completely that people forgot warfare had ever been different. The armored personnel carrier became one of the most important military vehicles of the 20th century. The M113, introduced by the American Army in 1960, carried 11 soldiers inside aluminum armor. It could swim across rivers and keep pace with the fastest tanks. Over 80,000 were built, and they served in every major conflict from Vietnam to Iraq. The Soviet Union developed the BMP, a fighting vehicle that carried infantry and mounted a powerful cannon. Britain, France, Germany, and Israel all created their own versions. Every design traced its ancestry back to those 75 converted M7 priests that Simonds's mechanics had built in 48 hours during August 1944. The Kangaroo was the grandfather of an entire family of vehicles. Simonds himself lived quietly after the war ended. He served as chief of the General Staff for the Canadian Army and helped modernize the force based on lessons learned in combat. He retired in 1955 and spent his later years writing about military history and theory. He died in 1974 at the age of 71. His funeral was attended by military officers and veterans who remembered him, but there were no crowds of mourners or television cameras. The man who had revolutionized armored warfare passed away as modestly as he had lived. A few newspaper obituaries noted his contributions, but most were brief and buried in the back pages. The broader lesson of Simonds' story goes beyond military tactics and vehicle design. It speaks to how innovation happens and who makes it possible. Throughout history, major breakthroughs often come from outsiders who are not trapped by conventional thinking. Simonds came from Canada's small, overlooked military, rather than the prestigious armies of Britain and America. He had not spent decades learning that certain things were impossible. He looked at problems with fresh eyes and asked simple questions that experts had stopped asking. Why do attacks have to happen in daylight? Why does infantry have to walk? Why do we keep doing what does not work? These questions seemed naive to professional soldiers, but they led to answers that saved thousands of lives. Eisenhower's decision to trust Simonds reveals something important about leadership. The Supreme Commander was surrounded by generals from famous military academies, men with impressive credentials and years of experience. He could have listened only to them and followed only their advice. But Eisenhower understood that experience can become a trap. People who have done something the same way for years find it hard to imagine doing it differently. They mistake familiarity for wisdom and tradition for truth. Eisenhower saw that the young Canadian with the unconventional background might see solutions that the West Point graduates had missed. He was right. Modern combined arms warfare still follows the principles that Simonds demonstrated in August 1944. Infantry rides inside armored vehicles instead of walking behind them. Tanks operate at night using thermal imaging and night vision equipment. Air support coordinates with ground forces to strike specific targets at specific times. Different military branches work together as integrated teams instead of separate services. These methods seem obvious now, but they were revolutionary when Simonds first proposed them. Every soldier who climbs into an armored personnel carrier owes a debt to a Canadian officer who asked why things had to be done the old way. The connection to present-day challenges extends beyond military applications. In any field, people face the same choice that Allied commanders faced in 1944. They can keep using methods that are familiar but failing, or they can listen to new voices with unconventional ideas. The experts and veterans will often resist change because it threatens their status and authority. The young and inexperienced will often see possibilities that experience has blinded others to. Progress requires leaders who can recognize good ideas regardless of where they come from. In war's darkest hours, it is often the outsider from the overlooked army, unburdened by the prestige and traditions of the great powers, who sees what veterans cannot. Eisenhower understood this truth when bullets were flying and men were dying. He understood that success demands trusting the unproven mind over the proven method, the courage to make that choice, to bet lives on an untested idea from an unlikely source, separates great leaders from merely competent ones. Guy Simonds gave Eisenhower a way to win. Eisenhower gave Simonds the chance to prove it could work. Together, they showed that innovation and trust can overcome even the strongest defenses. That lesson remains as true today as it was on that dark August night when 720 vehicles rolled forward and changed warfare forever.